River valleys. Just the idea of them conjures up romantic notions of hearth and home, pastoral and tranquil places of peace, overflowing with abundance. But when rivers overflow, peaceful valleys become relentless torrents of water, destroying anything and everything in their path. The Red River Valley, 116,000 square kilometers stretching from South Dakota to Manitoba. Its source, the Red River, one of the only major rivers on the continent to flow northward, born from a prehistoric glacial lake that once covered the prairies. It is home to some of the richest farmlands in Canada and hundreds of thousands of people. But the valley is a valley in name only.
The basin is very, very flat. It averages, the Red River slope averages about a half of a foot per mile.
The flatness of the land makes it ideal for farming, but it also leaves it wide open to disaster.
The river itself is designed by nature to carry a certain amount of water. And once you get above that, the water goes over the banks and floods the surrounding land. And if it goes over the banks by a foot, it'll go 2 miles because it's so flat.
The river was a very strong factor in our life. Every spring we looked at it quite nervously to see what was going to happen.
In 1950, Sandra Birdsell is an 8-year-old girl living with her parents and 10 brothers and sisters in the farming community of Morris, Manitoba. The 1,500 people who live in Morris have seen their share of floods.
Several times my mother and father had to put the piano up on top of a structure so that it wouldn't get ruined, and pile the furniture on top of the dining room tables or haul it up to the second floor.
Floods have in fact forced Sandra's family to leave their home 4 times. But most years, the flooding is manageable.
We listened to the water, listened to it coming into the basement. We used to report on it and say, well, it's not up to the bottom step yet, or it's up to the bottom step, and now it's up to the second step, and sort of gave my mother a forecast.
But while people in rural areas watch for signs of flooding each spring, residents of Winnipeg aren't very concerned. The last major flood happened more than 100 years earlier, in 1826. So by 1950, Winnipeggers aren't expecting anything serious to happen. Harold Loynes is a 29-year-old businessman living with his wife Marion in a middle-class suburb of Winnipeg in 1950. Loynes has saved long and hard to afford his house, and though modest, it's a source of great satisfaction.
We were married in 1944, and this was our first house. Even though it was small, we were proud of it.
His house is built on low-lying ground, but Loynes isn't concerned. But what he and most other Winnipeggers don't know is that by the end of March 1950, water levels on the American side of the valley are already 35% higher than the year before. A terrible chain reaction is beginning.
The colder it is, the more the ground freezes to a greater and greater depth, and that means that once the snow melts in the springtime, it has nowhere to go. It has to go over land rather than sinking into the ground. And then a critical thing is how quickly the snowpack melts. Rapid snowpack melting causes a lot more runoff than if it just slowly melts.
And there is one more ingredient adding to the mix.
It was very rainy, very dull. The snow had melted and the rain melted it a lot.
No one realizes it, but they are about to become part of a devastating human drama. Conditions south of the border are steadily deteriorating. people in Manitoba finally begin to take notice.
We realized that this Red River was going to flood because we got advance notice from Grand Forks and Fargo that, you know, they had been flooded ahead of us, and it was coming this way naturally because it's flowing north into Lake Winnipeg. The closer it came, then we realized that this was for real.
Grand Forks, my goodness, they were in terrible time, having a terrible time, and we felt so badly for them.
Arn McEwen and his wife own a home in another suburb of Winnipeg.
Our house was only a matter of a few weeks old when we moved into it, with all oak floors and lovely kitchen. Everything was nice.
Their neighborhood is also built on low-lying ground. But even though the area is vulnerable to flooding, Arn and his neighbors think they can avoid real trouble by building a dike.
We somehow thought that we were going to be able to survive it without any damage.
At first, there is little government organization. People who aren't able to move easily, such as seniors and hospital patients, start becoming concerned. So residents across the city take matters into their own hands, building dikes neighborhood by neighborhood.
Sandbag dikes were the main thing because we really hadn't had a bad scare like this before.
The mood of the people we were working with on the dike was, to start with, it was treated as a bit of a lark, if I use that word. But then it became very serious when we realized what we had to fight against, that it wasn't a lark, that it was very, very serious.
Then by mid-April, the weather finally turns sunny and warm. In Winnipeg, with the dikes mostly in place, spirits also take a turn.
We felt we were home free, and there was nothing to worry about. People could sit out in the back and enjoy the sunshine.
They have no idea that in just a few days, they will be racing to save their city and everything they own. In April of 1950, Winnipeggers are watching the weather very closely. There's been an unusually quick thaw after a cold winter. And the warm weather has changed again, with more rain and wet snow falling. Ideal conditions for a major flood.
We sort of knew we were going to get it, but the question was how much and when.
So far, officials have been downplaying the danger. In fact, it isn't until mid-April that a hastily prepared disaster system is announced, prompted by the now rising levels in southern Manitoba. But in Morris, Sandra Birdsell's family has been watching the levels more closely than ever before. They sense that somehow this year is going to be very different. Then, suddenly it hits. In the middle of the night on April 27th, as the town sleeps, Morris is bombarded by a raging wall of water.
The water came up onto the second floor. My mother had to leave the house through a bedroom window into a boat. My mother was actually dragged out an upstairs window because she did not want to leave her house.
Overnight, Morris is transformed. The entire town underwater.
You look and you can see how far that river has swept out of its banks, and then there's pieces and chunks of ice that are shearing off trees and cutting them down, and you see the odd dead cow or pig go floating by.
The river is now completely out of control and is headed towards Winnipeg. Everyone is horrified to see the flood for what it truly is, the worst in more than 100 years. And there is no escape. Winnipeg is about to be hit with the full force of the swollen Red River.
It was like a huge wall, and we thought we were safe as a bug in a rug there. We thought we were safe. And then I noticed one day a trickle of water coming underneath the dike, coming through the sandbags at the bottom of this here huge wall.
Then on Friday, the 5th of May, the water rises 15 centimeters in a matter of hours, making it impossible for sandbaggers to keep up. Black Friday has arrived.
It blew. The dike just imploded.
As Winnipeggers watch in horror, one by one, every dike in the city breaks. Water rushes into Winnipeg with a force and a volume that no one is prepared for.
Within a few minutes, the house was well underwater. We ended up on the 2nd floor in our house with the water right just below us. That's where we lived during the flood. All I could think of was that, well, there goes my house.
We realized that the water was coming up over the 1st floor. We got a truck and loaded every piece of furniture we had into the truck. It was all water. You couldn't see any streets, sidewalks, or anything, or road.
Loyens takes his wife to higher ground while he continues to help in any way he can.
As soon as the water got up to, our basement was nearly filled, I moved her out. I said, you go and stay with your parents, and I'll come when I have to.
He is scheduled to watch over a friend's house in an area not yet flooded. But with his own home needing care, he switches shifts with another volunteer, 26-year-old Scotty Ogg. It is a fateful decision.
He was a single man, early 20s, big-built man, good-looking gentleman.
Scotty Ogg is keeping watch with 2 other men, Gil Scholes and Bill Taylor. At 10 that night, the 3 of them are in the house. Scotty Ogg is standing near the top of the basement stairs, watching the water rise. The other men are standing just above him when disaster strikes.
With no pre-warning, there's no pre-warning at all, but the dike that had been built behind the houses broke, and the water just came in, pushed the back door right in. And Bill Taylor grabbed Gil Scholes and threw him on the kitchen floor, and he reached for Scotty, but by that time he was washed down into the basement, and there was no way of saving him. Would but by the grace of God go I, because that's the shift I would have been on, and I could have been in the same position as he was. Took them about 4 or 5 days to find him. He was right up in the rafters.
The town of Morris is completely underwater, and everyone must leave. For Sandra Birdsell's family, this creates almost as much anxiety as the flood itself.
For me, the most difficult aspect of the disaster was being separated from my family. Because then there were 11 of us, we couldn't all stay in the same home. And I can remember someone telling me that you shouldn't cry because water attracts water. And I would just bring on more water if I cried. And I guess I did.
By now, 5,000 military personnel have poured into the city, where a state of emergency has finally been declared. Food is scarce. As homes disappear under a sea of water, 80,000 people are evacuated, the largest evacuation in Canadian history. For people unable to leave, it is especially terrifying. Those in hospital are rescued by amphibious vehicles called ducks.
There had been an epidemic, a polio epidemic, where people lost the ability to breathe on their own, and they were in very bulky, large iron lungs. And the Navy went out using ducks and evacuated these very awkward, heavy, large iron lungs and took the people out.
By now, more than 130,000 square kilometers of Manitoba are underwater. Rumors of contagious disease are rampant. All anyone can do is wait for the water to crest.
It was an enemy that you could never really confront in one place. You could never point a finger at it and say, stop. It was so relentless, and there was no way you were going to change it other than try and build those dikes.
Finally, on May 14th, it crests at 9 meters above winter ice levels. The river, which usually is 150 meters wide, has become a lake 65 kilometers wide and 100 kilometers long.
It was so big, the flood was so big, it was all over southern Manitoba.
Although the worst is over, the full realization of the damage is yet to come. Only after the Red River crests can the people of Manitoba fully understand what has happened. The flood has been the worst in more than 100 years. And for many who have been evacuated, it will be a long time before they're able to return.
We thought we'd only be gone 2 weeks or 3 weeks or something like that, and not, I think it was 2.5 to 3 months, maybe even longer, that we were away.
When they are allowed back to their homes, it isn't a pretty sight.
It was just completely gutted. It was just like the guts of the house spilling out from the walls. My father had to rip all the walls off. And then he had to go into the basement and jack up the floors to straighten them because they were all wavy, the floors. The town was completely mud from one end to another, a dirty, filthy kind of clay mud that coated everything and hardened so that you would have to take a hammer and a chisel to chip it off of various things. It was disease-filled so that we weren't allowed to touch, and we had to wash our hands for fear of diphtheria and typhus, and had all these shots that we had to have so that we could live in our neighborhoods once again.
Some people just packed up and left their house there and never even went into it. I know of 1 or 2 families, they never looked back. They just closed the door, locked it, and moved out, and said, that's it.
The flood has in fact ruined more than 10,000 homes in Winnipeg alone. Water damages are estimated at $50 million, close to $1 billion in today's figures.
The Winnipeg flood was very well documented and publicized in other parts of North America, and many, many people contributed money, and they built up a huge reserve of funds.
I was in pretty dire straits because I absolutely didn't have any money, and I didn't know how I was going to be able to pay to redo the house. I was just dependent on the government subsidized me to repair the house.
We thought we were going to be absolutely bankrupt until the Canadian government set in to help us out. It was something that was almost spiritual. The whole of Canada was trying to help us. I remember that very, very well, and to this day.
Public debate now centers on how to prevent this devastating event from happening again. A royal commission is established and advises a floodway built to divert water away from Winnipeg.
It got the government to realize that Manitoba is not going to be Manitoba without some sort of preventive measures.
The newly elected Conservatives, led by Duff Roblin, start building the floodway in 1962. Nicknamed Duff's Ditch, it is finally completed in 1968 at a price of $63 million. First regarded as a waste of money, it has proved itself year after year. One of those times was in 1997, when the Red River once again overflowed its banks, this time with a much greater amount of water than even the 1950 levels. But the floodway minimized the damage and the danger for Winnipeg.
The 1950 flood flooded about 10,000 homes in Winnipeg. The 1997 flood, I think, flooded 9 homes in Winnipeg. Give you some perspective. The devastation, 100,000 people evacuated in the 1950 flood. Perhaps 10,000 in Winnipeg were evacuated during the 1997 flood.
For those who lived through the 51 days of devastation, fear, and backbreaking work in the flood of 1950, it may be hard to think there could be anything worse. Yet even with the tremendous havoc it created, there is not much evidence of the flood today.
I got members of my own family who don't believe it. My granddaughter, for example, she didn't believe it until I showed pictures. But it's so difficult for people that are born later, you know, that it's difficult for them to see the houses now and the streets and to think the water was up over that house.
The flood was a pivotal moment for me in terms of my life as an artist and my life as a writer. I wrote a book for children called The Town That Floated Away. And in a way, that's the way it felt for me, that the entire town had disappeared and just didn't exist. The realization that I came away with from this flood is that the world is an unstable place, insecure, that what you see is not necessarily what's there, and then it can change quite quickly.